Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 61, Brunhilda Part 1, Queen Energy. Today's episode will be the first part of the promised bio of Queen Brunhilda, wife of King Sigebert I, and mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and regent for 3 generations of Merovingians to follow. And right from the beginning, I have to tell you that thanks to my own intemperance, there will be another part. There was just too much to write to get it done in time, and rather than make you all wait even more, I thought I should release this first section and then get the rest out next week. By necessity, this will also be a slightly smaller biography of Brunhilda's nemesis, Fredegund, since their lives are so closely intertwined. And in the process, in a life and times kind of way, I'll hopefully be able to shed some light on the actual practice of government in the early Merovingian kingdoms. Indeed, in this first half, it ends up being more setup and government than actual incident, but so it goes. Really, though, it isn't actually possible to write biography in the modern sense for any woman in the 6th century Europe. Our sources are all exclusively the product of men, all of whom were inheritors of the full package of Greco-Roman prejudices. Their misogyny doesn't necessarily reach the heights of later post-Cluniac reform writers, but that's not to say it doesn't exist by any stretch of the imagination. Most often, it's expressed by omission. The activities of women, even royal wives and daughters, is usually passed over without note, as if they never were. Women do appear, of course, queens, obviously, and especially holy women and saints. Male commentators are perfectly capable of expressing admiration for women, as Gregory of Tours did for Queen and later Abbess Radegund, and later on the Venerable Bede will do for Hilda of Whitby. But generations of Frankish princesses disappeared down into the vortex of history, married off and apparently forgotten, sometimes with not even a name to remember them by. For those we do know, any sense of their inner life is deeply obscure, and though to be fair, that's pretty much the case for everybody of the period, regardless of their gender. In that context, the amount of commentary on the activities of Brunhilda and Fredegund stands out all the more. We know more about the early life of Brunhilda than that of her rival, but that really isn't saying very much. She was the younger of 2 daughters of King Athanagild of the Visigoths, and was probably born around 543, probably in Toledo. If you think back, you may remember that Athanagild was one of the 2 kings fighting over the lordship of the Visigoths, which civil strife opened the door to the Byzantines and their conquest of the southern littoral of Hispania. Athanagild ultimately emerged as the winner, but given the homicide rate among Visigothic rulers up till then, victory probably only brought marginal peace of mind. Having the empire as a downstairs neighbor did not improve his sense of security, and so he was looking for friends. Fortunately, that's exactly what daughters are for. A marriage alliance with one of the kings of the most powerful realms of the post-Roman West could help secure his northern border, and lend his somewhat battered crown some polish. Some legitimacy. There was also the small matter of Guntram, the Merovingian whose lands bordered directly on Athanagild's territories in Septimania, and who was making threatening noises. Connecting with one of Guntram's brothers might discourage him from joining in on any raids. The other rulers of Europe were perfectly aware of the situation between the various Frankish brothers. Merovingian kings, generally, had not been particularly concerned about the social status of their spouses or partners. A high-ranking consort could bring kudos, especially if she arrived as part of the spoils of war, as Radegund had done for Clothar the Elder, and daughters were married off in search of advantage just as they had been elsewhere for all time, but for themselves, the Merovingian males seemed to have been happy to follow their hearts. The several forms of marriage that we've talked about earlier encouraged this, since some variants required no formalities at all and could very easily shade into simple kidnapping. However, the circumstances of Brunhilda's marriage suggest that King Sigebert was looking for something a little shinier than his brothers and uncles. Sigebert disapproved of his brother's foibles, and according to Gregory, he went specifically looking for a wife of more exalted blood. But where to look for such a thing? No matter how cordial the relationship with the Franks, the Byzantines would most likely never countenance marrying an imperial woman to one, so that was a non-starter. The Thuringian royal houses had already been humbled and absorbed. There's little advantage to be had there. Meanwhile, Italy was in chaos, and while the Ostrogoths might be eager to find a daughter they could send in exchange for military aid, the Franks at the time were resolutely examining their fingernails and not getting involved in any of the mess on the far side of the Alps. Britain and the lands beyond the Elbe were still warrens of pagan tribes, though that wasn't necessarily a deal breaker, as we'll see later. But right now, marrying there might be more trouble than it was worth. That left Spain and the Visigoths, and so King Sigibert sent his emissaries to negotiate with King Athanagild. The discussions would have taken months, but both sides were motivated. In the end, it was agreed that Brunhilda would make the journey from sunny Spain to less sunny north of Francia. The Franks were pleased, since
the young woman was elegant in all that she did, lovely to look at, chaste and decorous in her behavior, wise in her generation, and of good address. Her father sent her off to Sigibert with a large dowry. Sigibert ordered a banquet to be prepared and married Brunhilda with every appearance of joy and happiness.
That was Gregory. There were still religious issues to deal with. The Visigoths had not yet made the transition to orthodoxy, and you may remember a few decades ago a Frankish princess had to be rescued from her abusive Arian husband. Athanagild and daughter seem to have been of a much more practical bent. Brunhilda, for her part, knew better than to be obstinate, far away from home, and surrounded by people who were entirely capable of making her life miserable. So the bride converted with barely a quibble, after a serious and apparently reasoned discussion with her new husband and his bishop. Gregory says that they convinced her, but really, it went so easily that I'm gathering it was more a matter of education than actual debate. Brunhilda would take to her new faith with enthusiasm, as later behavior would show, though she would never reach or aspire to the heights of devotion of a saintly figure like Radegund. At the time of their marriage in 567, Brunhilda would have been in her early 20s, Sigibert 7 or 8 years older, and they seem to have gotten along well enough, as far as we can tell. Meanwhile, Sigibert's half-brother Chilperic saw the happiness in the realm next door and desired the same for himself. That's the kindest way of putting it. Given what we already have heard about Chilperic, I could also put it this way. Chilperic saw the prestigious match that his half-brother had made and the wealth that it had brought, and it pricked at his insecurities. How come he has one and I don't? I want one too! Now, Chilperic already had a woman, Fredegund, and I put it that way because it's not clear whether he was married to her at the time or not. At least, married in a way that other heads of state would recognize or respect. Either way, he put Fredegund aside and sent his own ambassadors to the Visigothic king looking for a marriage at least as shiny as his big brother's. Athanagild saw no downside to having two Frankish kings in the family, and further isolating Guntram, agreed and dispatched Brunhilda's older sister, Galswintha, with a similar dowry, similar pomp, and similar circumstance. Why the younger Brunhilda was married before her sister is not a question that seems to have a clear answer. Primogeniture was far from the norm, and so the order of marriage of daughters would seem to carry less import, but still it seems odd, and I found no good explanation. Fredegund, the woman he had put aside, had already shown herself to be something of an operator. Chilperic had been married before to a woman named Audovera, with whom he had already had 3 sons. Fredegund had been a servant in Audovera's retinue and had caught Chilperic's eye and convinced him, one way or another, to divorce Audovera and send her to a cloister. What role she had in the Galswintha deal is open to question. Was she put aside by her capricious lover, or did she agree to be placed strategically on a back burner while the dowry negotiations were undertaken? Regardless, Galswintha was welcomed by her new husband with celebration and feasts, and rebaptized a Catholic just as her sister had been. Gregory, in one of his cattier moments, assures us that
he loved her very dearly, for she had brought a large dowry with her.
Marriage, in my experience, is a mostly life-enhancing institution, but Chilperic found marriage to Galswintha to be less so. Galswintha seems to have had expectations and standards, and she found her treatment at Chilperic's court unfitting for her position. This is yet another area where it would be wonderful to have a more complete accounting of the relationships and personalities. What exactly was dissatisfying the queen? Chilperic, for his part, did not seek marriage counseling, mediation, or honest discussion of their goals or needs. Such was not his temperament. He took a more direct and much more characteristic approach. He buttonholed a servant and suggested that perhaps Queen Galswintha would be better off dead. A year or less after getting married, Galswintha was strangled in her bed, her body left for her shocked husband to find. Within a few days, Chilperic had reconciled with Fredegund, to the disgust of his brothers, bishops, probably anyone else who heard about it, and to the undying rage of Galswintha's sister Brunhilda. We need to be a tiny bit careful about all of this, though. First of all, Gregory is generally unsympathetic to Chilperic for all kinds of reasons, and he is deeply prejudiced against Fredegund and never passes an opportunity to portray her as cruel, vindictive, immoral, and the ultimate source of all the interfamiliar strife that was to follow. Later on, when the story of these years was taken up by the chronicler known to us as Fredegar, that role will be filled by Brunhilda. The evil stepmother trope was as strong in Merovingian Francia as it had been in Imperial Rome, and for that reason, I think that we have to assume, whatever crime we're talking about, the truth is that Livia did it. All that aside, it does seem certain that Galswintha was murdered, and it seems equally certain that Brunhilda believed Chilperic and Fredegund had murdered her. And so began the feud that would shape Merovingian politics for the next 4 decades. Now, I say that, and I've said that before, and it is happily repeated by many secondary sources. But nowhere does Gregory explicitly say that Brunhilda was motivated by blood feud. That arises from other sources and from reading between the lines, and this round of conflict between the brothers arose autochthonously. I encountered that word for the very first time in Wolfram's History of the Goths 4 years ago, and am delighted to have finally found a place to use it. Autochthonous. Anyway, I am sure that Sigebert disapproved of Chilperic murdering his new wife and taking back his lowborn fancy woman. But I struggle to see, at this early stage, that any of the 4 brothers needed any extra incentive to fight with each other. Especially Chilperic, who seems to have been consistently the black sheep of the 4 and regularly made himself obnoxious to his half-brothers, by, for example, sending his son to capture some of Sigebert's southern towns and to burn others. And that gives me a slightly tenuous excuse to launch into a potentially deep digression by asking one question. What exactly were these 4 fighting over? We can say that they were fighting over territory and move on, but territory in the sense of redrawing a line on a map would have had little meaning to them in the way it does to us. There were no accurate maps. How would they have understood their own goals? And it's part of a larger question. What exactly is it that a king does? Based on the evidence of this podcast, you could be forgiven if you were to answer that the primary function of a Frankish king was to engage in mindless violence in the search for wealth and status. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but it is an oversimplification to say that that is what a king or ruler's only or even primary function was. Isidore of Seville, who was contemporary of our Gregory of Tours and whose Etymologia would be one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages, and who is also, by the way, the patron saint of the internet. How about that? The things you learn. Wrote that
God gave the governance to princes for the ruling of the peoples. Therefore the office of ruling ought to profit the people, and not to harm them, not to press on them by lording it over them, but to consult with them, so that this badge of power might truly be beneficial, and they might use this gift of God for the protection of the members of Christ.
from the very beginning, the most important functions of the king were to dispense justice and to provide protection. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a well-off landowner. You have several farms and people and servants to work them for you. You also, unfortunately, have neighbors of more or less equal wealth, and one of them has decided that he likes the look of that field down the valley, the one with the big rock at the corner. In the spring, he sends his workers to the field to begin the plowing, and when your people arrive, they are told that the field is under new management. You may send some of your more muscular people to drive the interlopers off, but your neighbor has thought of that and has sent some of his own beefsteaks to protect the plowmen. A fight breaks out. There are broken teeth. One of your men loses a finger. Meanwhile, your greedy neighbor is claiming that everyone knows that field with the rock has always been his, and that you had no right to be working on it in the first place. Who will you go to help resolve the dispute? You might go to your other neighbors, but you both have history with all of them, and they may not be impartial. More importantly, you all have more or less the same amount of muscle available, which will make it difficult for either of you or any one of them to enforce any decision that might be reached. No, you need to go to someone who is more powerful than either you or your neighbor, and who is disinterested in the outcome of your disagreement. By going to this judge, whether he be lord or king, you and your neighbor agree to be bound by his decision, and so put yourselves in his power. He may request a fee or tribute in return for his consideration. Scratch that, he will absolutely request a fee or tribute in return for consideration. A lord will have several subordinates who come to him for justice, and the lords in turn will go to the king to resolve their own disputes. If you have a very good memory, you may recall the Kindants, the judge king of the Goths before they crossed over the Danube. This function of leadership is integral to the Germanic tradition of kingship, and in earlier days was often separate from the role of war leader. Migration led to a streamlining, combining the roles in the person of the Gothic kings, and contact with Rome led to greater sophistication of the philosophy of law. And that's its own subject, which I keep meaning and promising to get to, and I will one of these days. And in a way, this kind of justice is a subset of the king's responsibility to protect his subjects, as in this case, he protects them from each other. And for both this internal and external protection, as I said, he expects his own rewards in the form of legal fees, fines, and taxes, or sometimes service. And all of that is a rather long-winded way of explaining what these Merovingian brothers were actually fighting over. They were fighting over the right to be the final arbiter of disputes in the various regions, and to collect the fees and fines that resulted from that power, and also to claim the taxes that were generated by them. The Roman apparatus for collecting those monies was beginning to decay, but its organization remained centered in the cities, and so the right to appoint officials that controlled cities and oversaw the collection of those taxes was commonly at the core of conflicts. These officials were drawn from a cloud of loyal men that surrounded each of the kings, his comitatus. Individually, these men were known by the Latin word comes, which is often and unhelpfully translated as count. This is indeed where that noble title derives, but it gives the wrong connotation if we use it this early. Yes, I know, I've used it plenty, mea culpa. Comes actually means companion, and that is a much more accurate description of the relationship. These are men of status, fighting men, wealthy men with their own lands and influence, who the king could delegate to carry out his wishes. These could be anything, except for a handful of the very top jobs there was little specialization. A king's companion may escort guests, train young fighters, act as a purchasing agent, oversee harvests or the collection of taxes and tribute, or any other service his king could think he was suitable for. His most trusted would be dispatched to the various cities to act as royal representatives and overseers, and to liaison with the local bishops, who would have stronger local networks that they could hook into. The loyalty of these men was obviously key. These were very personal relationships. By the 6th century, most of the bureaucratic institutions of the empire were crumbling away, except at that most local bishop level. And so every part of the royal government's effectiveness depended on the effectiveness and loyalty of the comes on site. That loyalty was a matter of principle, of course, but also a matter of personal advantage. So in the conflicts between the Merovingian brothers, there was a matter of either placing your own man in a particular city, or, sometimes, convincing your brother's man to change sides. Okay, so given all of that, where do queens fit in? Just because their activities are mostly unrecorded does not mean that royal women were universally passive, and queens in particular could be very influential. They could influence their husbands directly, of course, depending on the personalities involved. And ultimately, the queen's position depended on the production of heirs and of maintaining a good relationship with the king. But with that as a starting point, queens worked as hard as anyone to build up their own bases of power. Queens held their own property, their morgangabe, which was granted to them by their husbands upon marriage. Chilperic had granted Galswintha a truly gobsmacking morgangabe of 5 cities in his efforts to show up his half-brother. What that really means is that he granted her the tax revenue of 5 cities as her own personal income. Such personal property and wealth could then in turn be used to build up a clientage from among the nobility and other fighting men, as it gave the queen the wherewithal to grant patronage, jobs, annuities, and so on, in return for loyalty and support when needed. She might set up abbeys or monasteries, both for spiritual support in the form of the occupants' prayers, as well as a kind of retirement plan, since abbeys were often where noble widows went to live out their later lives. On top of her personal wealth, the queen also had considerable access to the royal treasury, in the traditional wifely role as manager of the domestic household, and could use those resources to her advantage as well, in some consultation with the king, of course, but many queens enjoyed wide latitude in day-to-day affairs. Nobles, both male and female, and other members of the comitatus would elbow each other to win the queen's favor almost as much as the king's. The inevitable negative result of all of this was the appearance of factions, since those with influence would fight to keep it, and those without would fight to get it, and things could get very nasty very quickly. Ultimately, it was all part of the same shoving match. Nobles jockeyed with each other for influence, wealth, and land, and the Merovingians jockeyed with each other for wealth and land to distribute in order to grow their power. And the queens and noblewomen were right there in the snake pit with everyone else. The first round of squabbling between brothers mainly revolved around Sigebert and Chilperic, with Guntram and Charibert dropping in and out on one side or the other. The thing went back and forth for a while, but eventually circumstances turned against Chilperic. He lost a son in the fighting. Brother Guntram, who had been mostly on his side, abandoned their alliance and sided with Sigebert, and many of the nobles and magnates that had supported Chilperic began to find other ways to spend their time. Never try and catch a falling knife, they may have said to each other, as they sent their regrets. Pursued by Sigebert's forces, Chilperic was forced to seek refuge in the fortified city of Tournai. Sigebert was confident. He had his wife and children join him in Paris as he made ready to march east. He and Brunhilda had been pretty regular at the outset of their marriage, and in the first 3 years, Brunhilda had given birth to 3 little Franklets, 2 girls and a boy. We aren't entirely sure of their birth order, but can say that at this moment they would have ranged between 5 and 8 years old. I can imagine Sigebert crowing with confidence to them as they waved him out of the gates. He had Uncle Chilperic on the ropes, was going to make him submit, give up his claims to a whole bunch of cities, and hand them over to Sigebert and Guntram. It was inevitable. All Sigebert had to do was sit down outside Tournai and wait. As he was making his preparations to leave, the Bishop of Paris, later to be known as Saint Germain, offered him advice. If he intended to spare his brother's life, then his endeavor would end successfully. If not, then Sigebert should consider the words of Solomon in the book of Proverbs. Whoso digs a pit for his brother shall himself fall in. That's chapter 26, verse 27, if you're wanting to look it up. Gregory's fellow bishops all seem to have had an amazing talent for foreshadowing. Disregarding the good bishop's exhortation, Sigebert left Paris and headed towards the final showdown at Tournai. As he went, he accepted the submission of the surrounding towns. Everything was coming up roses. But the roses had thorns, as they often do. In a town called Vitry, near Calais, in the press of people that surrounded the king as he accepted accolades and declarations of loyalty, 2 men indicated they wished to speak with him. Sigebert agreed, and once they were a little bit apart from the crowd, the 2 men struck at the king with their seaxes, wounding him badly. Most sources name Fredegund as the instigator of the murder, though it's doubtful she acted without the knowledge and at least tacit approval of Chilperic. The stricken Sigebert was carried to his tent, but it turned out the blades had been poisoned, and Sigebert soon died. Small side note, accusations of poisoned blades are fairly common in the sources, and while I have no doubt that it did happen, it's just as likely that an especially aggressive infection leading to sepsis could be attributed to poison. As another aside, one of the things that strikes me about this and many other stories of political assassinations from the time is the very easy access to the king. Leaders are not siloed off from their constituencies the way they often are now. It really reinforces that personal nature of kingship. A king must be seen by his great men, he must be accessible to them, and seen by the people as well, or these relationships will break down and the government will cease to function. I doubt that's what Brunhilda was focusing on at the time, though. The news struck her like a charging bull, according to Gregory.
She was prostrate with anguish and grief, and hardly knew what she was doing.
We can't know for sure how she felt about her husband personally, but let's give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that she at least liked him a little bit. More pressing than her personal grief, though, was her safety and the safety of her children. The girls were probably all right in the short term, but little Childebert was in immediate danger. The loyalty of Sigebert's comites was decisive. One of them, named Gundevald, gathered as many of Sigebert's subjects as he could, took possession of Childebert, and took him to Metz. On Christmas Day 575, he declared the 5-year-old king. There is a story about Brunhilda lowering her son in a bag on a rope to the waiting Gundevald and escape. The point there being that she consented to her son's removal from her custody. Their worries were well founded. The military pressure on him having evaporated, Chilperic moved to retake his lost possessions and to make a play for those of his deceased brother. In the process, he moved into Paris and took Brunhilda and her daughters prisoner, along with all the treasury that Brunhilda had with her. That's significant in light of our previous discussion. It's doubtful that Brunhilda had anything like the whole royal treasury with her, but it was certainly an amount significant enough for Gregory to mention, and the loss of it removed a great deal of Brunhilda's ability to influence others. Brunhilda was sent to Rouen, while her daughters were sent to Meaux, a town on the Marne east of Paris. We don't know the nature of either's captivity, but rotting in dungeons is unlikely. They were most likely hosted as involuntary guests, either in the house of a nobleman loyal to Chilperic or on one of Chilperic's own estates. Chilperic was busily trying to scoop up as much territory as he could, and to that end he sent one of his sons on a mission to the west, to Poitiers. Now, as we've seen before, these moments of the death of kings leads to instability within the larger Merovingian family and folks trying to make all kinds of different power plays. In this case, the son, whose name was Merovech, decided that he didn't want to go to Poitiers, and instead he disobeyed his orders and headed to Tours, where he spent Easter, and his army made themselves a nuisance by commandeering the supplies of the surrounding farms and villages. Merovech was a child of Chilperic's first wife, Autochthonous, and therefore a target for the malice of Fredegund, who was determined that her own children would be the ones to inherit. His rebellion in this case seems to have been an attempt to carve out a power base for himself that he could use to oppose his stepmother's machinations. One way of bolstering his position was to tie himself to one of the other Merovingian houses, and so he put out the word that he was going to go visit his mother, and, under cover of that, traveled to Rouen. Once there, he, quote, made Brunhilda his wife. This is another one of those episodes that absolutely begs for more detail, which Gregory simply does not give. How much choice was Brunhilda given here? Was it actually her idea? Her continued presence in Rouen, while her son remained at Metz, suggests that she was still in some kind of custody. So was this a rescue? It also suggests that the people around her son had made no move to free her, and may have been actively ignoring her. The marriage was clearly counter to Chilperic's wishes, as well as against canon law, since Merovech was her nephew, though there was not technically a blood relation. Attaching herself to Merovech may have been part of a play to regain control over Childebert and her late husband's lands. Who knows, maybe she also liked him, but that's really irrelevant, actually. We can't know, and Gregory ain't telling. He does tell us that Chilperic was indeed unhappy about the turn of events, and went to Rouen in all haste to separate the pair. Merovech and Brunhilda holed up in a church and refused to come out until Chilperic finally swore that they could remain together as long as it was God's will, which is a pretty smooth way of leaving your options open, if you ask me. For now, he seems to have decided that what was done. Maybe he thought that he could use the marriage to sow discord among the nobles that surrounded Childebert. But he received them as family members, and Brunhilda was free. Well, freer than she had been before. But Chilperic still had plenty to be worried about when it came to Childebert and the men around him. Still a child he may have been, but his father's comitatus weren't going to give up their new lord's patrimony, or their own positions, without a fight. To that end, an army was assembled in Champagne and marched on Soissons, where Fredegund and one of her sons was staying. Chilperic rode to meet this new threat and took Merovech with him, either because he needed the men, or to keep an eye on him, or both. Brunhilda was left behind in Rouen, apparently left in the wind for the moment, and she needed to decide what to do next. And we'll leave her there for now, watching from the gate as Chilperic and her new husband rode away to the east. Next time, we'll pick up Brunhilda's story. She had to see to the safety of her daughters and to find her way back to her son, which she would eventually. Once there, it will become clear that Brunhilda is not the kind of woman who will sit in the background while the menfolk around the young king run things for him. She would exert her own considerable influence and begin the first of the periods of regency that defined her life. Until then, thank you all for listening and supporting your emails and messages on Instagram and on Facebook. I appreciate you all, both individually and as a group. And I haven't said anything about them specifically for a while, so special thanks to monthly supporters Micaiah, Paul, Alex, John, Dusty, Jesse, Barchester, Toasty, and to new supporter, Mr. Jordan. I hold you all close to my heart. All right, that's it for now then. Until next time, take care.